Chapter 1. The ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry, yet the silence in the back of the limousine felt as ancient and heavy as stone. Julian Vance did not look at his bride. Instead, he stared out the tinted window at the gray drizzle slicking the asphalt of downtown Manhattan, his reflection ghosting over the flashing neon signs of the city. His jaw was locked, a muscle ticking rhythmically beneath his sharp, clean-shaven cheekbone. Every breath he took tasted like ash and defeat. To the financial press, the union of Julian Vance and Clara Morno was hailed as a brilliant alliance, a strategic stabilization of two warring shipping dynasties. To Julian, it was a humiliating concession. His grandfather, Arthur Vance, had made the amendment to his final will ironclad. To inherit the controlling shares of Vance Global, Julian must marry within 30 days of his 30th birthday to a partner approved by the family trustees. And when the company's stock took a devastating hit 3 months prior, the trustees had pulled Clara's name from the ledger like a rabbit out of a hat. The daughter of a disgraced, bankrupt agricultural freight broker. A girl from the periphery of society, thrust into the light because her family name still held historical land easements the board desperately coveted. "You can stop holding your breath," Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. He finally turned his head, his cold gray eyes sweeping over her with calculated indifference. "The cameras aren't following us anymore. You don't have to play the demure, grieving bride." Clara sat on the opposite side of the spacious leather interior, perfectly upright. She was not crying. She was not trembling. While most women in her position would have been overwhelmed by the sudden leap from quiet obscurity into the gilded cage of the Vance Empire, Clara looked entirely composed. She wore a simple, unadorned cream-colored dress that contrasted sharply with the extravagant designer gowns Julian's mother had tried to force upon her. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly, revealing a slender neck and a face that possessed a quiet, unyielding sharpness. "I wasn't holding my breath, Mr. Vance," Clara replied. Her voice was steady, lacking the tremor of intimidation he expected. "I was calculating the mileage between the cathedral and your penthouse." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. He had anticipated a meek, malleable dependent, someone he could ignore, shut away in a guest wing of his sprawling penthouse, and trot out for charity galas when the public relations department demanded a smiling face. This calm, analytical detachment caught him off guard. "Let's get a few things straight," Julian said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees as he invaded her personal space. "This is a contract, nothing more. You get financial security for your younger siblings, and I get my grandfather's shares. Beyond these leather seats, we share a last name. Inside my home, we are strangers. You stay out of my way, I stay out of yours, and by the end of 3 years, we quietly file for an amicable dissolution on the grounds of irreconcilable differences." Clara met his gaze without flinching. Her dark eyes were deep, unreadable pools that seemed to look right through his calculated intimidation. 3 years, she repeated quietly. She tilted her head, a faint ghost of a smile touching the corner of her lips, not one of amusement, but of a quiet, weary irony. "And what happens to the house staff? Do I need to brief them on my allergies, or should I simply learn to be invisible from the start?" "Invisible is a strong word," Julian scoffed, leaning back and turning away from her to look back out the window. "Let's go with irrelevant." The car glided into the underground private garage of the Vance Tower, the tires hissing against the damp concrete. Before the driver could even put the vehicle in park, Julian pushed his door open and stepped out into the chill air, not waiting for her, not offering a hand. He strode toward the private elevator, his long coat billowing behind him like a dark shroud. He wanted a wife on paper, a ghost to satisfy a dying old man's whims. He had no idea, not even for a fraction of a second, that the ghost he had just dismissed was the only thing standing between him and absolute ruin. Chapter 2. 3 months passed in a blur of glass, steel, and absolute silence. To the outside world, Julian and Clara presented a flawless image of modern aristocracy. They attended charity auctions where Clara stood beside him like a marble statue, polite, breathtakingly composed, and utterly silent. Julian's business associates praised her understated elegance. Reporters wrote glowing profiles about the reclusive corporate heir who had finally found his anchor. Inside the penthouse, however, they were ships passing in the dark. Julian left before dawn, returning late at night after the boardroom lights had flickered out. He ate takeout at his mahogany desk, reviewed Port Authority manifests, and fought a brutal, silent war against a hostile takeover led by the Sterling Group. He was so consumed by his obsession with keeping the logistics sector afloat that he failed to notice the subtle rhythms of the woman living under his roof. He didn't notice the way Clara spent hours in the study, her laptop illuminated by the cold blue glow of spreadsheets, cross-referencing shipping data from defunct regional firms. He didn't notice the worn leather notebooks filled with handwritten freight logs stacked neatly on the bottom shelf of the library. To Julian, Clara was simply part of the furniture, a quiet fixture of the penthouse that required no maintenance and offered no utility. It was a Tuesday evening when the first real tremor hit. Julian sat in his private study, a tumbler of whiskey untouched on the desk. The digital clock on the wall glowed 11:42 p.m. Across from him sat Marcus Vance, his cousin and head of corporate compliance, looking pale under the recessed lighting. "They're moving faster than we anticipated, Julian," Marcus said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Sterling has quietly bought up 3 of our regional distribution hubs in Sector 4. If they secure the 4th one by Friday, they control the entire supply chain conduit into the eastern seaboard. The emergency clause in grandfathers will trigger automatically if we lose majority logistics control." Julian slammed his hand onto the desk, rattling the crystal tumbler. "How? Sector 4 is locked down under private municipal leases. No one can buy those plots without board authorization." "They didn't buy the plots, Julian. They bought the underlying debt of the original managing trust," Marcus said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Kestrel Holdings, remember them? They went bankrupt 3 years ago. Sterling acquired their toxic assets through a shell company overseas. Legally, they own the historical easements." Julian felt a cold drop of sweat trace the back of his neck. Kestrel Holdings. He had dismissed them years ago as a minor regional failure. If Sterling controlled those easements, they could legally choke Vance Global's freight lines within 48 hours, forcing a fire sale of the company. "What's the deficit?" Julian asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy whisper. "How much do we need to buy out the encumbrance?" $40 million in liquid capital, Marcus said, looking down at his shoes. "And we don't have it, not unless you liquidate your personal holdings, which would take weeks to clear." Julian stared at his cousin, the floor seemingly dropping out from beneath him. 70 years of family legacy. His grandfather's empire, built on blood, steel, and ambition, all of it slipping through his fingers because he had ignored a blind spot in his own supply chain. "Get out," Julian said quietly. "Julian, I said get out." Marcus fled the room, leaving Julian alone in the suffocating silence of the study. He stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering, indifferent expanse of New York City. He had fought so hard, pushed everyone away, built walls of ice around his heart, convinced that emotions were a weakness and that he alone could carry the weight of the world. And now, the world was crushing him. A soft click sounded at the door. Julian didn't turn around, assuming it was the housekeeper or Marcus returning with more bad news. "I told you to leave me alone, Marcus," Julian rasped. "I'm not Marcus," Clara's voice replied. Julian turned slowly. Clara stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her usual immaculate daywear. She wore a simple dark silk robe, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She looked smaller, softer, yet there was an absolute stillness in her stance that commanded the room. In her hands, she held a thick, worn manila folder. "What do you want, Clara?" Julian asked, his voice sharp with displaced exhaustion. "This isn't a social hour. The company is collapsing. Go back to your room." "I know the company is collapsing," she said, stepping into the study. She didn't flinch at his tone. She walked right past his desk, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. "Because you've been looking at the wrong set of books for 3 months. Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "The wrong books? Are you an accountant now, Clara? Did you pick up a degree in corporate finance between charity galas?" "My father didn't go bankrupt because he was a bad businessman, Julian," Clara said, her voice terrifyingly calm as she placed the manila folder squarely in the center of his desk. "He went bankrupt because his company was systematically targeted by a predator who wanted his land easements. The exact same easement Sterling is using to choke you right now." Julian stopped laughing. He stared at her, his gray eyes narrowing as a cold prickle of realization washed over him. "What are you talking about?" "Kestrel Holdings didn't just liquidate," Clara said, resting her hand on the edge of the desk and leaning in slightly. "They were bought out by a private trust managed by a man named Henderson. And Henderson died 6 weeks ago. Under state probate law, unliquidated private trust assets tied to regional land easements revert automatically to the primary surviving bloodline of the original Morno patent holders." She tapped the manila folder with a single finger. "Which happens to be me, and which is legally consolidated under the prenuptial agreement your lawyers forced me to sign 8 months ago." Julian stared at the folder, then up at her face. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The cold, untouchable billionaire found himself completely, utterly speechless, struck dumb by the woman he had spent a third of a year treating like a ghost. Chapter 3. The mahogany of the executive boardroom table was cold against Julian Vance's palms. He didn't feel it. What he felt was the rhythmic, sickening thud of his own pulse hammering behind his ribs, loud enough to drown out the low murmur of the board members whispering behind their hands. On the central screen, the stock ticker flashed red. Vance Industries was bleeding. Arthur Pendleton sat across the table, leaning forward with an oily, thin-lipped smile. "Mr. Vance," Pendleton said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The market opens in 20 minutes. If you cannot present a certified solvency injection or an equivalent asset transfer by 9 o'clock, the emergency clause triggers. You know as well as I do that your liquid reserves are tapped out." Julian said nothing. His jaw was locked so tight his teeth ached. He had missed it. In his ruthless, singular focus on the logistics sector, he had completely ignored the lateral consolidation of the supply chain, the exact flank Sterling had used to slip the knife in. "Time is up, Julian," Pendleton whispered, sliding a thick, leather-bound restructuring agreement across the glossy wood. "Just sign it. You can stay on as a figurehead vice president of operations. It's a soft landing." Julian's hand hovered over the gold-plated fountain pen. His fingers trembled, a microscopic twitch of pure, unadulterated fury. Sign it, and he destroyed 70 years of Vance family legacy. Refuse it, and he walked out of this building with nothing. He reached for the pen. "Don't." The voice was quiet. It didn't carry the booming resonance of the boardroom, nor did it shake with panic. It cut through the tension like a scalpel. Julian froze. From the corner of the room, sitting quietly in one of the high-backed leather chairs reserved for silent observers, Clara stood up. Julian hadn't even looked at her when he entered the room. She was just there. The woman he had married in a cold, transactional ceremony. Clara Vance, née Morneau, brought into his glittering, predatory world to act as a pretty, silent ornament. "Clara," Julian muttered, his voice sharp with sudden defensive embarrassment. "Sit down, this isn't your place." "You missed a decimal point, Julian," she said, stepping forward. Her slate-gray tweed blazer was simple, slightly frayed at the edge of the cuff, and her hair was pinned back with careless efficiency. "This is a closed executive session," Pendleton barked, his face flushing with irritation. "Security, please escort." "Quiet down, Arthur," Clara said. It wasn't loud, but the sheer, unshakable weight in her tone made the old man snap his mouth shut. She reached out and tapped a single cell on the secondary monitor with her knuckle. "You're looking at the Port Authority logistics through the primary Vance Morneau freight manifest," Clara said, her voice even. "That's your first mistake. Sterling didn't buy the Port Authority, they bought the secondary storage hubs in Sector 4 leased under Kestrel Holdings." Julian blinked, his mind stalling. Kestrel. Kestrel liquidated 3 years ago. "They liquidated their public assets," Clara corrected, walking closer to the table, her gaze shifting to Julian. There was no pity in her eyes, only a cold, razor-sharp intelligence that made Julian's breath catch in his throat. "My family built those storage hubs. When my father's company went under, the debt was bought by Henderson. And Henderson died 6 weeks ago." She reached into her battered leather tote bag, pulled out the thick manila folder, and dropped it right on top of Pendleton's restructuring agreement. The papers slid across the mahogany, coming to a halt against Julian's fingertips. "Probate law dictates that unliquidated private trust assets revert to the primary bloodline holding the historical land easements," Clara continued, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. "Which happens to be Morneau Logistics, which happens to be legally consolidated under my name as part of our prenuptial property transfer." The room went dead silent. The digital clock on the wall clicked toward 8:42 a.m. Pendleton stood up so fast his chair screeched against the marble floor. That's impossible. Those warehouses have a valuation of over 40 million. The legal chain of custody is right here," Clara said, tapping the folder. "Certified by the state appellate court yesterday afternoon. I didn't mention it because you never asked, Julian. You were too busy trying to prove you could carry the entire empire on your own shoulders without looking at the people standing right next to you." Julian slowly raised his head, staring up at her. The shock hit him like a physical blow to the chest, driving the air from his lungs. For 8 months he had treated her like a ghost, a nuisance, a contractually obligated anchor. Yet here she stood, having quietly unraveled a $40 million corporate trap while he sat sweating over a pen, ready to surrender his entire life's work. "You," Julian's voice cracked, the words scraping raw against his throat. He looked from the documents to her face, searching for a trace of malice. There was none, just a quiet, unblinking steadiness. "You knew about this before we walked in." "I knew Sterling was moving on you 3 days ago," Clara said simply, her chin lifting. "You were too proud to look at your own audit logs, so I looked for you. Do you want to save your company, Mr. Vance, or are you going to keep staring at me like you've just seen a ghost?" Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. Across the table, Pendleton's face had gone the color of spoiled milk. This changes nothing about the board's majority vote. "The board's majority vote relies on the solvency clause," Julian said. His voice had changed. The panic was gone, replaced by a low, razor-sharp steel that made even Pendleton step back. Julian picked up the pen, not to sign the surrender, but to flip it over, using the heavy metal barrel to push Pendleton's agreement off the table. It fluttered down like a wounded bird landing softly on the carpet. Julian stood up slowly, towering over the boardroom. He didn't look at the board members. He looked only at Clara. The Morneau Trust covers the exact deficit required to nullify the emergency clause, Julian said, his eyes locked onto hers, the words heavy with an unspoken weight that went far beyond balance sheets and stock tickers. And as the primary stakeholder of those assets, he paused, his chest rising and falling heavily, my wife has just vetoed the restructuring. Clara didn't flinch. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something warm, something real and fragile touched the edges of her dark eyes, breaking through the ice. Julian turned his gaze back to the pale, shaking executives, his voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. Meeting adjourned. Chapter 4. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind them, leaving Julian and Clara alone in the private antechamber. The ambient hum of the building's ventilation system was the only sound filling the space, a dull, rhythmic breath that seemed to amplify the electric tension humming between them. Julian didn't move. He stood near the head of the mahogany table, his hands resting flat against the polished surface, his chest still heaving slightly from the adrenaline surge of the confrontation. His knuckles were white. Clara stood a few paces away, her posture still composed, though her fingers lightly clutched the strap of her leather tote bag. She watched him, waiting, offering no hollow triumphs, no vindictive barbs. 40 million, Julian finally said, his voice low, breaking the silence like dry twigs snapping underfoot. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the scattered papers of Pendleton's rejected agreement on the floor. You sat on $40 million of unencumbered leverage for 3 months while I treated you like a piece of decorative porcelain. You didn't ask, Clara replied simply. Julian let out a harsh, self-deprecating breath that sounded almost like a laugh. He slowly raised his head, his gray eyes locking onto hers. The cold, unyielding wall he had spent a lifetime constructing around himself felt cracked down the middle, letting in a blinding, uncomfortable light. Ask. Julian stepped around the table, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate strides. There was no arrogance left in his posture, only a raw, unsettling vulnerability that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. I didn't even look at you, Clara. I relegated you to a footnote. I made a prison for you in that penthouse and congratulated myself on keeping you out of my way. I knew what the marriage was, Julian, Clara said, her voice softening just a fraction, though her gaze remained unyielding. It was a contract. You needed a name. I needed protection for my family. We both got what we bargained for. No, Julian said, stopping just inches from her. For the first time, he allowed himself to look at her, really look at her, not as a legal obligation, not as a corporate asset, but as a person. A brilliant, fierce, incandescent person who had walked into a lion's den without a weapon and walked out holding its leash. That's not what this is anymore. You saved Vance Global. You saved my grandfather's legacy. More than that, you saved me from my own arrogance. Clara looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face, looking for the cold, haughty stranger she had married. She found only a man stripped of his armor. And if I hadn't, Clara asked softly, testing him, if I had stayed in the penthouse and let Pendleton take the company, would you have hated me less? Julian flinched, the question hitting him like a physical blow. He reached out, his hand hovering uncertainly in the air for a fraction of a second before his fingers gently brushed against the frayed cuff of her tweed blazer. The touch was hesitant, almost reverent. I would have hated myself, Julian whispered, the words scraping raw against his throat, and I would have deserved every second of it. Clara didn't pull away. She let his hand rest against her arm, the warmth of his skin sinking through the fabric. The quiet distance that had defined their marriage for 8 long months evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying intimacy that neither of them had planned for. The board will try to countersue, Clara said quietly, her voice steady even as her breath hitched slightly at his proximity. Pendleton won't go down quietly. We have 48 hours to consolidate the Morneau Trust into the primary corporate charter before the quarterly audit. Julian let out a slow breath, a faint, genuine smile, the first one Clara had ever seen on his face, touching the corners of his mouth. Let them try, Julian said, his fingers sliding down to wrap firmly around her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. With you on my side, I'd like to see them try. Chapter 5. 3 weeks later, the rain had cleared, leaving the Manhattan skyline washed in the brilliant, golden light of a late autumn afternoon. The penthouse was no longer a silent, echoing fortress of cold marble and glass. In the kitchen, the low hum of conversation and the rich scent of roasting garlic drifted down the hallway. A domestic chaos that Julian Vance would have found intolerable 6 months ago, and now couldn't imagine his life without. In the private study, the heavy oak doors stood wide open. Julian sat behind his desk, reviewing the final restructuring papers of the Morneau-Vance consolidation. The hostile takeover had been thoroughly dismantled. Pendleton and his co-conspirators had been ousted from the board, their shares bought out and redistributed. Vance Global was stronger, leaner, and more secure than it had ever been. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor, light and familiar. Clara walked into the study, carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. She set it down on the corner of his desk, her fingers brushing lightly against his shoulder as she leaned over to check a margin note on the document. She was wearing a simple soft knit sweater, her hair pinned back loosely. Julian reached out without looking, catching her hand before she could pull away. He laced his fingers through hers, pulling her gently until she stopped beside his chair. "You're working too late," Julian said, looking up at her with a warmth in his gray eyes that had completely replaced the ice of their wedding day. "I learned it from a very stubborn man," Clara teased softly, a genuine smile playing on her lips. Julian stood up, pulling her close against him. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face for a moment in the crook of her neck, breathing in the familiar, grounding scent of her skin. The memory of the cold limousine ride and the suffocating isolation of their wedding day felt like a lifetime ago. "The grandfather's will amendment had a clause I didn't tell you about," Julian murmured against her skin, his hands holding her tighter. Clara leaned back slightly, her dark eyes sparkling with quiet curiosity. "Oh, what clause?" Julian pulled back, looking down into her face with a quiet, fierce intensity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Not the heavy, ornate family heirloom ring from their arranged ceremony, but a simple, elegant band of platinum, unadorned and entirely uncalculated. It said that if the marriage was proven to be a fraud within a year, the shares would revert to charity, Julian said softly. His thumb traced her cheekbone. "It didn't account for the fact that the woman I never wanted became the only person I ever truly needed." He dropped gracefully to one knee on the study floor, looking up at her with a vulnerability he had never shown another human being. "Clara Morno," Julian said, his voice ringing clear and steady in the quiet room. "The contract is void, the board is gone, it's just you and me. Will you marry me for real this time?" Clara looked down at him, the quiet strength in her eyes softening into a profound, radiant joy. She didn't hesitate. "Yes, Julian," she whispered, her hands sliding into his hair as he stood up to pull her into a fierce, desperate embrace. "Yes, the end."